Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of 1970 and a mystery that has remained frozen in the landscape of Norway for over 50 years. Let your breathing slow now. Imagine the air of late November. It is sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the heavy, metallic promise of snow. We are traveling to the outskirts of Bergen, a city cradled by 7 mountains, where the North Sea whispers against the fjords. But we are moving away from the light of the harbor, deep into a place the locals call Isdalen, the Ice Valley, or, as some whispered even then, the Valley of Death. It is a place of steep scree slopes and jagged boulders, where the sun struggles to reach the valley floor during the short winter days. On the morning of November 29th, 1970, the valley was silent, save for the crunch of frost underfoot. A university professor and his 2 young daughters were out for a hike, navigating the rugged terrain on the north face of Mount Ulriken. The girls were ahead, their laughter muffled by the heavy mist that clung to the heather. They were looking for the beauty of the wild, but the atmosphere began to shift as they climbed higher into a remote clearing. The air grew thick, not just with fog, but with a peculiar, acrid smell that didn't belong in the pristine wilderness. It was the scent of something charred, something chemical, lingering in the still mountain air like a dark veil. As the children rounded a large rock formation, they stopped. There, wedged among the gray, moss-covered stones of a scree slope, they found what they first thought was a discarded shop mannequin. But as the father caught up, the true horror of the scene crystallized in the pale morning light. It was the body of a woman. She was lying on her back, her arms pulled up toward her chest in what investigators would later call the fencer's position, a natural reflex of the body when exposed to intense heat. Her front was severely charred, her face rendered unrecognizable by the flames. Yet, strangely, the back of her body remained untouched by the fire, as if she had been pressed hard against the cold, unyielding earth while the heat blossomed above her. The scene felt staged, almost ritualistic. In the silence of the valley, the items surrounding her seemed to tell a story without words. There was no campfire nearby, no signs of a casual traveler resting for the night. Instead, personal objects were laid out with haunting precision. A pair of blue rubber boots sat nearby. A woolen jumper, a scarf, and nylon stockings were scattered as if they had been tossed aside in haste, or perhaps arranged for a viewer. There were 2 plastic water bottles, their forms warped and melted by the heat, and a silver spoon with its hallmark meticulously filed away. Every label, every brand name, every tiny scrap of identity had been systematically removed from her clothing and her belongings. She was a woman without a name, found in a valley that seemed to want to keep her secrets buried. The professor stood in the chilling wind, shielding his daughters from the sight. He looked at the woman's watch and her jewelry, 2 earrings and a ring, which had been placed on a rock beside her, rather than being worn. It was as if she had stepped out of her life before the end came. Underneath her body, the investigators would later find a fur hat that smelled faintly of petrol. The ground was scorched, a blackened scar against the gray stones. There were traces of burned paper scattered in the wind, fragments of a passport holder that offered no clues, only the ash of a history she had chosen to incinerate. The silence of Isdalen felt heavy now, a weight that pressed down on the hiking party as they turned to begin the long, somber trek back down to the city to find the police. As the fog rolled in closer, swallowing the clearing, the mystery of the Isdal Woman began its long sleep. Who was she, and why had she come to this desolate place with enough sleeping pills in her system to drift into a permanent slumber even before the fire started? The smoke in the valley had cleared, but the questions were only just beginning to rise. For now, just listen to the wind in the pines. The mountain holds its breath. The investigation is about to begin, but the answers are still miles away, hidden in suitcases and coded notebooks yet to be found. Rest your mind. Let the cold air of the 1970 peaks fade into the warmth of your blankets. We are only at the beginning of the trail. The journey from the jagged rocks of the Ice Valley to the sterile, quiet halls of the Gads Institute of Pathology was a short distance in miles, yet it felt like a crossing into a different realm of existence. Behind the heavy doors of the morgue in Bergen, the air was no longer filled with the scent of damp earth and the biting winter wind of late November. Instead, it was replaced by the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic and the low, constant hum of the ventilation system. On the cold steel of the examination table lay the woman who had no name. The initial task for the investigators was to look far beyond the surface, to find the hidden story written in her very cells. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast long, thin shadows against the white walls as the coroners began their methodical work, seeking to understand how a life could end in such a desolate, blackened state. Externally, the woman was a complex puzzle of scorched fabric and damaged skin. She lay in what pathologists call the boxer's position, her arms drawn up in front of her chest and her fists clenched, a natural reflex of the human body when it is exposed to intense, sudden heat. Most of her features had been stolen by the fire, rendering her face a mask of tragedy that gave no clues to her heritage. Her long, dark hair had been mostly consumed by the flames, but a small, heartbreaking fragment remained at the nape of her neck, still tied with a blue and white patterned ribbon. It was a hauntingly domestic detail found amidst the wreckage of a human life. As the examination continued, the doctors noted a dark bruise on her neck, a mark that could have come from a heavy fall against the unforgiving stones of the valley, or perhaps from a blow delivered by another hand. When the investigators looked inside, the mystery only deepened and took on a more chemical, calculated tone. Within her stomach, they found the remains of a staggering amount of medication that suggested a deep, heavy slumber before the end. There were traces of a sedative known as phenomal, which was a common brand of sleeping pills in the year 1970. The count was nearly impossible to comprehend. The analysis suggested that between 50 and 70 of these tablets had been swallowed in a short period. Most of them were still whole and had not yet been fully absorbed into her bloodstream, suggesting that her heart had stopped beating shortly after she took them. One can only imagine the heavy, fog-like sleep that must have been pulling at her consciousness as she sat among the cold rocks, the world around her fading into a chemical gray as the drug took hold. However, the most chilling revelation of the entire autopsy came from the woman's lungs. As the pathologists examined the delicate tissue, they found something that changed the entire nature of the case and added a layer of horror to the mystery. There was soot, fine, black particles of carbon, trapped deep within her respiratory system. This was undeniable scientific proof that she had been breathing when the fire was lit. She was not a lifeless body placed there to be hidden. She was alive, however tenuously, as the flames began to climb. The official cause of death was eventually recorded as a combination of the massive overdose of sleeping pills and carbon monoxide poisoning from the smoke of the fire. The realization was a heavy one for the detectives to bear. It painted a picture of a woman trapped in a dual nightmare, caught between a forced, drug-induced sleep and the sudden, violent heat of a mountain fire. While the doctors worked on the physical remains, other investigators turned their focused attention to what was left of her clothing. This is where the case shifted from a tragic mountain death to something far more sinister and professional. Every single piece of clothing she wore had been systematically and carefully altered. The labels, those small, silk tags that tell a story of where a coat was made or how to properly wash a scarf, had been meticulously removed. They were not ripped away in a struggle or worn down by years of use. They had been snipped out with the precision of a pair of scissors. From her heavy wool coat down to her most intimate undergarments, every identifying mark was gone. It was as if someone had spent hours preparing her for this final moment, ensuring that if she were ever found, she would be a ghost with no origin and a silhouette with no history. The erasure of her identity did not stop at her clothing. Scattered around her in the clearing were objects that should have provided clues, but instead offered only a profound and intentional silence. There was a matchbox from a local brand, its bright label a stark and mocking contrast to the gray rocks, yet it held no fingerprints and no scribbled notes. A blue silk scarf lay nearby, its delicate fabric somehow untouched by the fire that had claimed so much else. There were empty bottles that once held a liqueur, and plastic water bottles that were now partially melted by the heat. Each item was a dead end, a path that led back to a void. The woman had been stripped of her identity as carefully as a gardener prunes a rose, leaving nothing behind but the physical shell of a person. As the winter sun set over the city of Bergen, the investigators realized they were not just looking for a cause of death, but for the very soul of a human being who had been erased from the world. The search for the woman's story soon drifted away from the frozen rocks of the valley and into the bustling, rhythmic heart of the city itself. On the 2nd of December, 1970, just 3 days after her body was found, investigators followed a lead to the Bergen railway station. Imagine the scene. A cavernous hall filled with the scent of coal smoke and damp wool, where the clatter of trains provided a constant, restless heartbeat. There, in 2 luggage lockers, sat a pair of suitcases. They were heavy, hard-shelled things, waiting in the shadows for a woman who would never return to claim them. When the police turned the keys in those locks, they were not just opening luggage. They were opening a window into a life that had been meticulously constructed to be invisible. Inside the suitcases, the air was stale, carrying the faint, lingering scent of expensive soap and travel. The contents were laid out with a precision that felt almost clinical. There were clothes, elegant, high-quality garments that spoke of a person who moved through the world with a certain level of wealth. But as the officers began to lift each piece, the same chilling pattern from the valley emerged. Every single label had been removed. Where a brand or a size should have been, there were only rough edges and loose threads. It was as if she had taken a razor to her own history, ensuring that no shop in Paris, London, or Berlin could ever claim her as a customer. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that these bags were not the belongings of a simple tourist, but the toolkit of a ghost. Among the most startling discoveries were the disguises. Neatly tucked away were at least 8 different wigs, ranging in color and style, from deep ebony to lighter shades. They were the tools of a chameleon, allowing her to change her silhouette and her face at a moment's notice. Alongside the hair were several pairs of glasses. Some were dark sunglasses, but others were even more curious, non-prescription glasses with clear glass lenses. They served no medical purpose. They were purely for the sake of appearance, a way to add a layer of intellect or age to a face that was already a mystery. On one pair of these sunglasses, the police found a single, partial fingerprint. It was the only slip-up in an otherwise perfect erasure. When matched against the remains found in the valley, there was no longer any doubt. These were her possessions, her secrets, and her masks. The suitcases also told the story of a woman who belonged to no single nation. Tucked into the lining and scattered through the pockets was a collection of foreign currencies that would have made a banker dizzy. There were 5 crisp 100 Deutschmark notes hidden in the lining of one bag, along with Norwegian krone, British pounds, Swiss francs, and Belgian coins. She was a woman of the world, or perhaps a woman of the borders. Beside the money lay a small notepad, its pages filled with neat, handwritten lines of blue ink. At first, the characters seemed like a dense, unbreakable code, sequences of letters and numbers like 10M or 11M. But as the investigators stared at the ink, they began to see the logic of a travel log. It was a private map of her movements, a silent witness to a journey through Europe that was as complex as the woman herself. Even the smallest domestic items bore the marks of her strange mission. The police found 9 silver spoons, the kind one might find in a refined household, but the initials on the handles had been carefully scratched and filed away until the metal was smooth and anonymous. A tube of eczema cream sat among her cosmetics, its label partially scraped off so that neither the name of the prescribing doctor nor the identity of the patient could be read. It was a level of paranoia that went beyond mere privacy. It was a total, aggressive war against identity. She had removed the hair from her brushes, the labels from her makeup, and even the marks from her cutlery. In the quiet of the station locker, the investigators were looking at a life that had been scrubbed clean of every possible human connection. As the winter light faded outside the station, the items from the suitcases were tagged and logged, each one a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The wigs, the clear lenses, and the multiple currencies suggested a life spent in the shadows of the Cold War, a world of aliases and brief encounters in hotel lobbies. The woman of the Ice Valley was no longer just a body found in the woods. She was a professional, a shadow who had moved through the streets of Bergen with 8 different faces and a notebook full of secrets. But even as the police gathered her belongings, the most important question remained unanswered. Who was the woman beneath the wigs, and what was she so desperate to hide? The air in the police evidence room always carries a specific scent, a mixture of cold dust, old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of storage lockers. Among the items pulled from the woman's suitcases at the Bergen station, one small object drew more attention than all the elegant wigs and foreign coins combined. It was a simple black notepad, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, with a cover that felt slightly worn and smoothed by frequent handling. For the investigators in 1970, this was not just a piece of stationery. It was a silent, stubborn witness. As they turned to the first page, the room seemed to grow even quieter. There, written in a steady, disciplined hand, were rows of letters and numbers that appeared at first glance to be total gibberish. There were no names, no complete sentences, just a staccato rhythm of characters that hinted at a life lived entirely in a language of secrets. The ink was dark and bit into the paper with a precision that suggested a highly focused mind. Imagine a detective leaning in under the harsh, flickering glow of a desk lamp, the light reflecting off the white pages as he searched for a pattern in the chaos. The entries were short and cryptic. A single letter, followed by a string of digits, then another letter. It looked like a ledger for a business that dealt in something other than currency. The police initially wondered if it was a telephone cipher or perhaps a series of bank account numbers hidden in plain sight. But as they looked closer, they noticed a peculiar repetition. The letter B appeared often. So did O, S, and T. It was a puzzle that sat on the corner of the desk for days. A cryptic map that refused to reveal its starting point or its final destination, mocking the men who tried to read it. The breakthrough finally came when the investigators compared the notepad to the stack of hotel registration cards they had begun to collect from every corner of Norway. They realized that the letter N stood for November. The letter O was not a 0, but a symbol for the city of Oslo. Suddenly, the code began to dissolve into a coherent and chilling timeline. B was Bergen, S was Stavanger, T was Trondheim. Further down the list, they identified P for Paris and H for Hamburg. The numbers surrounding these letters were the specific dates of her arrival and departure. For example, a sequence like 02208P meant she had been in Paris from October 22nd to October 28th. It was a travel log, meticulous and cold, stripped of any personal reflection or human emotion. There were no mentions of the weather, no notes about a good meal, and no mentions of friends. Just the hard, mathematical facts of her movement. As the investigators traced her path across a map of Europe, the scale of her journey began to overwhelm them. This woman had been moving across the continent with a frequency that was exhausting to contemplate. In the spring and summer of 1970, She had been a shadow crossing borders with practiced ease. From the busy boulevards of Paris to the windy docks of Stavanger, she moved with a purpose that required at least 8 different passports. She was Genevieve Premier in one city, Claudia Tilt in another, and Elizabeth Lienhauer in a third. The notepad proved that these were not just random aliases chosen on a whim. They were part of a synchronized operation. Each entry in the diary was a timestamp for a change in skin. She was constantly shedding one identity for another as she boarded trains and checked into hotels, never staying in one place long enough to leave a lasting impression. There is something deeply lonely about the image this diary creates in the mind. We can almost see her sitting in a quiet hotel room, perhaps late at night with the curtains drawn, pulling this black book from her purse to record her latest arrival. She is surrounded by the colorful clothing and the professional wigs found in her suitcase, the tools she used to transform herself into someone else. The coded diary was her only anchor to the truth of where she had actually been, yet even that was written in a way that protected her secrets from a casual glance. It suggests a woman who knew she was being watched, or at the very least, a woman who lived with the constant, heavy expectation of discovery. In the height of the Cold War, such secrecy was the standard currency of a professional. The police began to suspect they were not looking for a lost traveler, but for someone trained in the sophisticated art of disappearance. The diary ended abruptly, the ink trailing off as if the story had simply run out of paper. The final entries coincided perfectly with her arrival in Bergen in late November. The last few lines of code mapped out her final days, a period where she moved between various hotels with increasing frequency, changing rooms and requesting different floors as if trying to shake a tail. The investigators looked at the empty pages that followed the last line of code, a vast white space that seemed to represent the silence of the Isdalen Valley itself. The diary told them where she had been, but it could not tell them why she was there, or who she was supposed to meet among the gray rocks. It was a bridge that stopped halfway across a dark chasm. As the winter wind rattled the windows of the station, the detectives realized the coded log was both their greatest lead and their most frustrating dead end. She had left them a map, but the path led only to a ghost. The investigators sat in a room filled with the scent of old paper and the low, rhythmic hum of a radiator. Outside, the winter of 1970 was settling over Bergen, but inside, the air was thick with a different kind of chill. They were looking at stacks of hotel registration forms, known as hotelsedler, gathered from every corner of Norway. Each slip of paper was a thin, rectangular window into a life that seemed to be dissolving as soon as it was recorded. As they spread the documents across a heavy oak table, a pattern began to emerge from the ink. It was not just a trail of a traveler, but a calculated performance. The ink was dark and the script was elegant, a beautiful, right-slanted cursive that handwriting experts would later describe as having a distinct French character. The way she formed her letters was deliberate and consistent, even as the names she signed changed with every new city she entered. The list of names grew into a strange, rhythmic litany. In Oslo, at the Hotel Viking, she had been Genevieve Lancier from Leuven. A few days later, the same hand signed the register at the Hotel Bristol in Bergen as Claudia Tilt. Then she was Claudia Nielsen in Stavanger, and Alexia Zarnemersche at the Neptun Hotel back in Bergen. The investigators tracked her through Trondheim as Vera Jarl, and through various other stays as Fenella Lork, Vera Schlosseneck, and finally, Elizabeth Lienhofer. At least 8 separate identities were woven into the fabric of her journey. It was a palette of lives, each one complete with a fake address in Belgium or Germany, yet each one tied to the same mysterious woman. They realized then that she wasn't just hiding, she was operating. She was a woman of 1,000 faces, moving through the fjords and mountain passes like a shadow that refused to settle. The hotel staff who encountered her remembered a woman who was composed, yet undeniably strange. At the Hotel Hordehamen, she was room 407. The staff noticed she was remarkably quiet, often staying inside her room for long stretches of time. But when she did emerge, she was always impeccably dressed, often wearing high-fashion coats and practical, sturdy boots. There was a particular detail that stayed with the receptionists. She frequently requested to change her room. At one hotel, she moved 3 different times before she was satisfied. She would ask for rooms without balconies, or rooms that faced away from the main streets. It was as if she were constantly measuring the angles of the spaces she occupied, looking for a corner where she could see without being seen. She paid for everything in cash, peelings of Norwegian krone or Deutsch marks from a hidden stash, never once leaving a digital or financial footprint. Witnesses began to fill in the sensory details of her presence. Some remembered a faint, sharp scent of garlic that seemed to cling to her, an unusual olfactory signature in the clean, salt air of the Norwegian coast. Others spoke of her hair. Sometimes it was long and dark, and other times it seemed shorter, more structured. When the police eventually opened her abandoned suitcases at the Bergen railway station, they found the reason for these shifting silhouettes. Neatly packed alongside her clothes were several wigs. There were also multiple pairs of non-prescription glasses and various cosmetics. She was a master of the mundane disguise, using small, subtle changes to ensure that no 2 people saw quite the same woman. She claimed to be many things: a traveling saleswoman, an antique dealer, a lover of beautiful places. She spoke to people in a mixture of French, German, and Flemish, her accent shifting just enough to keep her origins a mystery. The police were baffled by the sheer scale of the deception. To maintain 8 different aliases, she would have needed at least 8 different passports, yet none were ever found. The only remnant was a partially burned plastic passport holder discovered near her body in the valley. The level of operational security she maintained was far beyond that of a typical traveler or even a common criminal. It suggested a high level of training, a discipline that allowed her to live entirely within a lie for months on end. As the investigators stared at the beautiful, slanted handwriting on the registration forms, they felt the weight of a woman who had worked very hard to erase herself. Every name she chose was a new layer of armor, a new identity designed to deflect the gaze of the world. She had moved through 1970 like a ghost in a velvet coat, leaving behind only the echo of names that belonged to no one. The tragedy was that even with all these names, the most important one remained missing. She had given the world Elizabeth, Genevieve, and Claudia, but she had kept her true self locked away in the shadows of the Ice Valley. The investigation into her identities had revealed a map of her movements, but it had provided no map to her soul. She remained a silhouette, a woman defined only by the things she pretended to be. As the papers were filed away into case 134/70, the investigators knew they were no longer looking for a simple traveler. They were looking for a ghost who had spent her final days playing a deadly game of hide and seek with history itself. The palette of her identities was vibrant and varied, but the canvas underneath remained dangerously, hauntingly blank. The narrative moves now to the heavy, rain-slicked streets of Bergen. It is November, 1970. The city is cloaked in a persistent mist that clings to the cobblestones and the dark wood of the harbor buildings. We find ourselves standing before the entrance of the Hotel Hordehamen. It is a place of transit, a temporary home for travelers seeking shelter from the biting Norwegian wind. But for one guest, it would be her final sanctuary. The staff here would later provide the police with the most vivid, yet baffling, descriptions of the woman who would become a national ghost. They remembered her not as a corpse in a valley, but as a living, breathing enigma who occupied room 407. She was a woman of undeniable presence, moving through the lobby with a calculated grace that demanded attention while simultaneously pleading for anonymity. The air in the lobby was thick with the scent of damp wool and floor wax, But as she passed, a different, more curious aroma followed in her wake. The receptionists at the front desk recalled her as a striking figure. She often wore a dark, elegant coat and a fur hat that seemed more suited for the streets of Moscow or Paris than the rugged coast of Norway. Underneath the hat, her hair was dark and perfectly coiffed, though we now know it was likely one of many wigs found later in her luggage. When she spoke, her voice was low and controlled. She registered under the name Elizabeth Leenhofer, claiming to be from Belgium. The staff noted a small, distinctive gap between her front teeth when she spoke, a detail that added a touch of vulnerability to her otherwise formidable mask. She was described as having a proud posture, a woman who looked as if she belonged in the glossy pages of a fashion magazine rather than a modest hotel in a cold seaside town. Yet, despite her elegance, there was a tension in her shoulders, a way she scanned the room every time the heavy front doors swung open to let in the winter chill. What fascinated the hotel employees most was her mastery of language. To the waitress in the dining room, she spoke fluent, sharp German while ordering her meals. To the manager, she switched effortlessly into a melodic French. When she addressed the porters, she used a broken, accented English that made her origins impossible to pin down. She was a polyglot of the shadows, a woman who could transform her identity simply by changing her syntax. On her final registration form at the Hordehamen, she abandoned her usual neat handwriting for a clunky, hurried scrawl. It was as if the pressure of her secret life was finally beginning to weigh on her hands. The staff watched her sit alone in the dining room, a silent figure among the clatter of silverware and the low hum of local conversation. She was a woman who was perfectly comfortable in her own company, or perhaps she was a woman who knew that any companion was a potential threat to the delicate web of lies she had spun around her existence. Her behavior within the hotel was equally peculiar. She was never satisfied with her surroundings. At previous hotels, she had been known to change rooms as many as 3 times in a single stay. At the Hordehamen, she eventually settled into room 407, but she lived there with a strange, defensive ritual. Maids who entered the room to tidy the linens found that she had moved the heavy armchairs, placing them in the hallway outside her door when she was inside, only to pull them back in when she departed. It was as if she were creating a physical barrier, a way to ensure that no one could approach her door without making a sound. One cleaner recalled entering the room and finding a table turned on its side, blocking a portion of the floor. It was the behavior of someone who expected an intrusion at any moment, someone who was meticulously preparing for a confrontation that never quite arrived in the way she expected. Then there was the smell. It is a detail that appears again and again in the witness testimonies, a sensory clue that refuses to be ignored. Several staff members, including a shopkeeper who sold her a pair of sturdy rubber boots, noted that she smelled strongly of garlic. In 1970, garlic was not a common ingredient in the Norwegian kitchen. It was an exotic, pungent scent, foreign and somewhat overwhelming to the locals. It hung in the air of room 407, clinging to the curtains and the upholstery long after she had checked out. To the Norwegians, it was a scent of the South, of distant lands and unfamiliar cultures. It was a sharp, organic reminder that this woman was an outsider, a bird of passage who had flown from a place where the flavors were bolder and the secrets were deeper. This scent, combined with her expensive silk scarves and her numerous identities, painted a picture of a woman who was living a life of high-stakes theater, where even her breath betrayed her foreign origins. By the time she checked out of room 407 on the 23rd of November, she had left a trail of questions that would haunt the hotel staff for decades. She paid her final bill in cash, peeling off the banknotes with a steady hand, and requested a taxi to the railway station. The receptionist watched her walk out into the gray light of the afternoon, a solitary figure carrying the weight of her mysterious luggage. She had been a ghost in their hallways, a woman who spoke in many tongues but told no truths. She was the guest who moved furniture, the woman who smelled of garlic and expensive perfume, the elegant shadow who refused to be forgotten. As she stepped into the waiting car, the door to room 407 was clicked shut, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her secrets and the cold, empty silence of a room that no longer had a story to tell. But the story was far from over. It was merely moving into the freezing darkness of the Ice Valley. The Isdalen Valley is a place where the mountains of Bergen seem to lean inward, as if keeping a secret from the sky. Locally, it has carried a darker name for centuries, Death Valley. Long before the year 1970, it was known for its treacherous slopes and a history that felt heavy with the weight of those who had lost their way among the rocks. In late November, the valley is not merely cold, it is consuming. The mist clings to the scree, and the rain does not fall so much as it dissolves into the air, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of gray and black. It was into this bleak theater that a local man named Kettle Cavers stepped on a Sunday afternoon, just 5 days before the world would learn of the horror hidden in the brush. He was a man of the sea, a captain accustomed to reading the subtle shifts in the wind and the shadows on the horizon. But nothing in his years on the water had prepared him for the encounter that was about to unfold in the silence of the hills. Kettle was descending from the heights of Mount Floyan, his boots crunching rhythmically against the wet gravel of the trail. The light was beginning to fail, that early winter dusk that turns every silhouette into something mysterious. As he moved through the area known as the Ice Valley, the sound of other footsteps reached him. This was unusual. At that time of day, in such unforgiving weather, the trails were typically abandoned to the wind. He slowed his pace, his senses sharpening. Through the veil of light rain, he saw 3 figures approaching from the opposite direction, moving upward toward the more desolate reaches of the valley. As they drew closer, the normalcy of an afternoon hike vanished, replaced by a profound sense of wrongness that would haunt Kettle for the next several decades of his life. Leading the group was a woman. Even from a distance, her appearance was striking, though entirely out of place for the rugged terrain. She was not dressed in the heavy wools or the practical waterproof gear one would expect in the Norwegian wilds. Instead, she wore elegant, city-style clothing, the kind of attire one might see in an office or a high-end restaurant in the center of Bergen. She looked as though she had simply stepped out of a taxi and onto a mountain path. Her face, however, was what stopped Kettle in his tracks. As she passed him, the distance between them narrowed to just a few feet. He saw her eyes, and in them, he read a narrative of pure, unadulterated terror. It was not the look of someone who was lost, but the look of someone who knew exactly where she was going and feared the destination with every fiber of her being. She appeared resigned, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden, yet her gaze was frantic, searching his face as if looking for a lifeline in a storm. Behind her, separated by only a short distance, walked 2 men. They were tall, with dark hair and features that Kettle later described as Southern European. Like the woman, they were dressed with a strange formality, wearing long, dark coats that seemed to soak up the dim light. They did not speak. There was no conversation, no shared laughter, not even the heavy breathing of a strenuous climb. They moved with a synchronized, purposeful gait, their eyes fixed forward. To Kettle, they did not look like companions. They looked like shadows. They looked like keepers. They followed her with a precision that suggested they were not merely walking with her, but ensuring that she continued her ascent into the darkening valley. The atmosphere between the 3 of them was thick with a tension that Kettle could feel against his own skin, a coldness that had nothing to do with the November rain. In the heartbeat of a moment when their paths crossed, the woman did something that Kettle would never forget. She met his eyes directly, and her lips parted. She opened her mouth as if she were about to scream, or perhaps to whisper a single word for help. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the possibility of a revelation. But then, she looked past him, her gaze flickering to the two men in the dark coats trailing behind her. Just as quickly as she had prepared to speak, she snapped her mouth shut. The silence that followed was louder than any cry could have been. She pulled her coat tighter around her, lowered her head, and continued walking into the mist. She had made a choice, or perhaps she had realized that there was no choice left to make. Kettle stood frozen on the trail, watching the three silhouettes dwindle until they were swallowed by the gray throat of the Isdalen. The weight of that encounter sat heavy in Kettle's chest as he finished his walk. When he reached the safety of the city lights, the memory of the woman's terrified face felt like a physical bruise. He eventually spoke to a friend who worked within the police department, describing the strange trio and the obvious distress of the woman in the executive clothing. The response he received was as chilling as the valley itself. He was told, quite simply, to forget what he had seen. The official word was that the case was being handled, and his testimony was not required. It would be nearly 50 years before Kettle would finally tell his story to the public, a story of a woman who was walked into the mouth of Death Valley by two men in black, never to walk out again. Her silence in that rainy afternoon was the final preamble to the mystery that was about to be discovered among the charred rocks and the bitter ice. The memory of that fleeting encounter in the hills lingered like a ghost in the minds of those who had seen her. But while memories are fragile, physical evidence is cold and unyielding. In the first days of December 1970, the investigation shifted from the charred earth of the Ice Valley to the echoing, soot-stained halls of the Bergen railway station. The air there was thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp wool, a constant bustle of travelers moving through the gray winter light. It was in the left luggage office, tucked away behind a heavy wooden counter, that the police found the next pieces of the puzzle. 2 suitcases, labeled with numbers 6 and 9, had been left there on the 23rd of November. They were heavy, made of dark brown imitation leather, and they carried the secrets of a woman who had essentially vanished from the world. As the officers lifted them onto a metal examination table, the room fell silent. They were about to peel back the layers of a life carefully constructed and just as carefully erased. The act of opening those suitcases was a slow, methodical process. One by one, the items were cataloged. There was a peculiar assortment of clothing, stylish and well-made, yet every single label had been meticulously cut away. Even the brand names on her cosmetics had been scraped off with a blade, leaving only smooth, anonymous plastic. There were wigs in various shades and styles, several pairs of non-prescription glasses that seemed designed more for disguise than for sight, and a collection of maps and train timetables that spanned the continent. To the investigators, it felt as though they were looking into the kit of a professional shadow. But amidst this sea of intentional anonymity, tucked deep within the lining of one bag, their fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It was a small, delicate object that had somehow escaped the woman's campaign of erasure. A single silver spoon. The spoon was beautiful, its handle decorated with intricate patterns that caught the dim light of the precinct. In a world where every tag had been clipped and every name filed down, this small piece of silverware felt like a profound mistake on her part. Or perhaps it was a sentimental attachment she couldn't bring herself to destroy. An officer took a magnifying glass, tilting the spoon until the tiny stamps on the back came into focus. These hallmarks are the fingerprints of the silver world, and there, stamped into the metal, was a name, Marthinusson, and below it a location, Stavanger. This was the first solid, verifiable lead the police had found. It wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a compass needle pointing south, back toward the coastal city of Stavanger, where the woman had traveled before reaching her final destination in Bergen. The excitement in the room was palpable. For the first time, they weren't just chasing a shadow, they were chasing a transaction. The investigation immediately fanned out toward Stavanger. In 1970, News traveled by wire and telephone, and the call to the jeweler's shop was made with a sense of urgency. The shop, owned by the Marthanussen family, was a respected establishment, known for its fine craftsmanship and souvenir items. Detectives traveled there, the silver spoon tucked safely in a velvet-lined evidence box. They walked through the door of the shop, the bell chiming softly above them, a sound that felt strangely domestic compared to the grim reality of the Ice Valley. They presented the spoon to the jeweler, watching his eyes as he examined the work. He recognized it instantly. It was a souvenir spoon, part of a series they sold to travelers. But the question remained, could he remember who had bought it? Could a single sale in a busy shop provide the name that had been so violently scrubbed from the rest of her life? The jeweler leafed through his records, the sound of turning paper filling the quiet shop. He explained that these spoons were popular, often purchased by tourists as a memento of their time in Norway. He recalled a woman who had visited recently, a woman who spoke with a faint, unidentifiable accent and carried herself with a quiet, almost stiff elegance. She had been polite but distant, her eyes darting toward the street as if she were expecting someone. She had purchased the silver spoon with cash, refusing a gift box, and vanished back into the winter fog. While the jeweler couldn't provide a name, his description matched the growing profile of the Isdal Woman. This small silver object proved she was moving through the world as a consumer, leaving a trail of currency and silver even as she tried to stay invisible. It was a flicker of hope in a darkening case, a sign that no matter how much she tried to disappear, she still left pieces of herself behind in the hands of strangers. As the detectives left the shop in Stavanger, the weight of the silver spoon felt different. It was no longer just a utensil, it was a witness. They began to realize that the woman had spent weeks traversing the Norwegian landscape, checking into hotels under a rotation of aliases like Finella Lork and Elizabeth Lienhauer. Every hotel form she signed was a fresh lie, yet the silver spoon was a truth. It placed her in a specific shop, at a specific time, interacting with a specific person. It gave the investigators a sense of her physical reality, the way she might have held the spoon or looked at her reflection in its polished surface. But the mystery only deepened. Why would someone so careful to remove the labels from her underwear and the names from her medicine leave behind a hallmarked spoon from a local jeweler? Was it an oversight, or was it a breadcrumb left for those who would eventually find her? The trail was growing warmer, but the woman herself was still just a collection of expensive wigs and stolen silver, a riddle wrapped in the cold, gray mist of a Norwegian winter. The rain in Bergen has a way of swallowing secrets. It is a persistent, heavy mist that clings to the cobblestones and turns the colorful wooden houses of the wharf into muted silhouettes. As the winter of 1970 deepened, the investigators returned from Stavanger with heavy hearts. The lead of the silver spoon had brought them to a shop, yes, and even to a memory of a well-dressed woman, but the name on the receipt was just another ghost. Every thread they pulled seemed to dissolve into the damp air of the fjords. The momentum of the early weeks began to slow, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of clocks in the police station and the rustle of paper as case number 134/70 grew into a mountain of unanswered questions. The detectives sat in rooms thick with the smell of old coffee and tobacco, staring at sketches of a face that no one in the world seemed to claim. They had her fingerprints, her clothes, and her many names, yet she remained as translucent as the morning fog. Inside the forensic laboratory, the evidence was laid out with clinical precision. The autopsy reports were finalized, typed out on thin paper that crinkled under the touch of frustrated fingers. The findings were contradictory and haunting. In her stomach, the examiners found the remains of between 50 and 70 sleeping pills, a brand known as Fenimal. They had been swallowed in batches, some only hours before her death, others just moments before the end. But it was the soot in her lungs that kept the investigators awake at night. To have soot in the lungs meant she was breathing when the fire started. It meant she was alive as the petrol-soaked fur hat and the nylon stockings began to melt against the cold earth of the ice valley. How could a woman so heavily sedated by dozens of barbiturates have the strength to start a fire, let alone stand within its heat? The bruised skin on her neck suggested a blow or a fall, a final mark of violence that the official documents struggled to categorize. Despite these anomalies, the pressure from the upper echelons of the Bergen police force began to mount. The Cold War was a silent, suffocating presence in Norway during those months, with the secret tests of the Penguin missile occurring nearby and the strange sightings of the woman near military installations. The case had become a political weight. In early 1971, the chief of police made a decision that would define the mystery for decades to come. He reviewed the files, the pills, and the lack of a struggle at the scene, and he declared the death a probable suicide. For many of the boots-on-the-ground investigators, like Carl Haver-Aas, the ruling felt like a betrayal of the evidence. Suicide by fire while incapacitated by drugs seemed like a narrative designed for closure, not for truth. But the order was given. The investigation was to be wound down. The woman who didn't exist was to be tucked away into the archives of the unsolved. As February arrived, the ground in Bergen was hard with frost. On the 5th of February, 1971, a small procession moved toward the Malendal Cemetery. It was a cold, gray morning. There were no family members to follow the carriage, no friends to weep for a daughter lost. Instead, 16 members of the Bergen police force stood in the biting wind, their collars turned up against the chill. They were the only ones who knew her, and yet they knew nothing at all. They had chosen a Catholic ceremony for her, a decision based on the saints' names she had used in her hotel ledgers: Genevieve, Claudia, Elizabeth. They hoped that in the afterlife, at least, she might be greeted by the faith she seemed to mirror in her deceptions. A local priest was recruited to say a few words over a body that had no name, speaking to an audience of men who had spent months chasing her shadow. The coffin was not made of simple wood. The police had ordered a heavy zinc casket, a choice that spoke of a lingering hope. Zinc does not decay as wood does. It preserves what lies within. They were sealing her away, but they were also keeping her ready. They knew that technology might one day catch up to the secrets she carried in her bones and her unique dental work. They photographed her one last time, the images intended for a family that might one day come looking. The coffin was decorated with a few simple flowers, lilacs and tulips that looked vibrant and out of place against the winter soil. As the priest spoke of peace and the unknown, the only sound was the distant tolling of a bell and the soft thud of earth hitting metal. The woman of the ice valley was lowered into an unmarked grave, a temporary home that would eventually become a permanent residence of mystery. Back at the station, the final signatures were placed on the reports. The suitcases from the railway station were emptied, their contents tagged and placed into brown cardboard boxes. The wigs, the maps of Norway, the coded notebooks, and the expensive cosmetics were moved to the basement, away from the light of the working offices. The file for case 134/70 was slid into a metal cabinet, the metal drawer closing with a definitive, echoing thud. For the public, the story was over. The newspapers moved on to other tragedies, and the name, the Isdal Woman, began to fade from the headlines. But in the quiet corners of the precinct, and in the minds of the men who had seen the soot in her lungs, the case was never truly closed. It was merely waiting. The cold had preserved the evidence, and the silence of the ice valley had claimed another soul, leaving the world to wonder who she was, and why she had worked so hard to disappear into the frozen dark. For nearly 50 years, the silence in the Isdalen Valley was absolute. The case files, once thick with the frantic energy of investigators, grew yellow and brittle in the back of cold storage lockers. The mystery of the woman with the 8 passports seemed destined to remain a ghost of the 1970s, a relic of a divided Europe that had since moved on. But time has a way of surrendering its secrets when science finds a new language to ask the questions. As we move into the 21st century, the shadows of that frozen November day begin to lengthen, reaching forward into a world of genetic sequencing and chemical signatures. The investigation, dormant for decades, breathed again in 2016, as a new generation of seekers looked back at the valley with eyes that could see through the layers of the past. The revival of the search began not in the valley, but in the sterile, quiet corridors of Haukeland University Hospital. There, tucked away in the forensic archives, a small cardboard box held the only physical pieces of the woman that remained on this earth. For years, it was believed that her remains had been lost to time, but deep in a cellar, a forgotten jawbone was rediscovered. This bone, preserved with its distinctive dental work and gold fillings, became a biological map. To the naked eye, it was merely a fragment of a life cut short, but to the scientists at the University of Canberra, it was a vessel of memory. They did not look at the shape of the bone, but at the atoms trapped within the enamel of her teeth, atoms that had been waiting for nearly a century to tell their story. Imagine, if you will, the process of isotope analysis. It is a slow, methodical science that mirrors the patience of the woman herself. Every drop of water we drink and every morsel of food we consume carries a chemical signature of the soil and the rain from which it came. These elements, like oxygen and strontium, are woven into our bodies, becoming a permanent record of our geography. In the teeth of the Isdal Woman, the enamel formed in layers, much like the rings of a tree. The layers that grew when she was a small child of only 4 years old held a different signature than the layers from her adolescence at age 14. By vaporizing tiny portions of this enamel and passing them through a mass spectrometer, the scientists could hear the echo of her childhood, a chemical whisper of where her feet first touched the ground. The results were startling in their precision. The isotopes from her earliest years, around 1930, pointed away from Norway and toward the heart of Europe. The chemical profile suggested a childhood spent in southeastern Germany, specifically in or near the city of Nuremberg. This was a place of medieval architecture and dark forests, a city that would later become synonymous with the weight of history. The science suggests that she was born there, perhaps as the world was beginning to tilt toward the chaos of the Second Great War. In that quiet German city, she was a girl with a real name, a family, and a future that did not yet include the lonely slopes of a Norwegian valley. The water she drank as a child left a mark that even fire and 50 years of burial could not erase. But the map did not stop at her birth. As the scientists analyzed the enamel formed during her teenage years, they saw a shift in the chemistry. The signature moved westward. By the time she was 14, the isotopes indicated she had relocated to the border region between France and Germany. Perhaps it was the Alsace region, a land that has changed hands between nations more times than many care to count. This shift matches the earlier findings of handwriting experts, who noted that her elegant script bore the hallmarks of a French education. We can almost see her now, a young woman navigating the complexities of a borderland, moving through the rolling hills and vineyards of a region caught between two identities. She was becoming a creature of the borders, a woman who belonged to many places, and yet perhaps to none at all. This modern science provides a bridge across the decades, connecting the charred remains in Isdalen to a specific corner of the European continent. It tells us that she was likely born around 1930, plus or minus 4 years, and that she carried the minerals of the French-German border in her very skeleton. Even the gold in her teeth spoke of a life of travel, with dental work that suggested she had visited practitioners in places far removed from the cold north. While her name remains a secret held tight by the silence of the grave, Her body has finally spoken. The echo of science has given us a origin, a starting point for a journey that would eventually lead her to a rocky depression in the mountains of Bergen, where the fire of 1970 attempted to turn her story into ash. As we move further into the mysteries of the 1970s, the air grows colder, and the silence of the Norwegian fjords begins to feel less like peace and more like a held breath. We have spoken of isotopes and teeth, of childhoods spent in the borderlands of Europe, but now we must look at what this woman was actually doing as she crisscrossed the continent. The image of a lonely traveler begins to shift, replaced by something far more calculated. In the shadow of the Cold War, Norway was not just a land of mountains and sea. It was a front line, a place where the eyes of the East and West met in the dark. The woman we know only as the Isdal Woman was moving through this landscape with a purpose that defies simple explanation. In her abandoned suitcases at the Bergen railway station, investigators found a small, unassuming notepad. At first glance, it appeared to be a jumble of nonsense, a series of codes and dates that meant nothing to the casual observer. But when the Norwegian armed forces and security services turned their eyes toward those pages, the pattern emerged with chilling clarity. Each entry was a meticulously recorded log of her travels, written in a shorthand that obscured the names of cities like Stavanger, Oslo, and Paris. This was not the diary of a tourist. It was a travel log. It mapped out a journey that had spanned months, showing that she had entered and exited Norway multiple times, always changing her identity, always shedding her skin like a ghost passing through walls. But it is the timing of these travels that truly sends a shiver through the narrative. During the year 1970, Norway was in the midst of developing a top-secret piece of military technology known as the Penguin missile. This was a sophisticated, anti-ship guided missile, a pride of the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. Trials were being conducted along the rugged coastline, particularly in the waters near Stavanger. When investigators overlaid the woman's coded itinerary with the classified schedule of these missile tests, the overlap was nearly perfect. She was there, in the small towns and coastal outposts, exactly when the military was testing their newest weapon. She was a shadow following the fire of the rockets, watching from the periphery of the secret trials. One account tells of a fisherman in the Stavanger area who remembered seeing a woman matching her description. She wasn't looking at the scenery or the historic architecture. She was looking out at the water, watching the movements of the naval vessels with an intensity that felt out of place. This was a period of heightened tension, an era of NATO war games like the Arctic Express, where the presence of a foreign national with 8 different fake passports was more than a mere curiosity. She operated with what the police would later call conspiratory behavior. She used names like Genevieve Lancier, Claudia Tilt, and Elizabeth Lienhofer. She wore wigs that changed her silhouette, and she never stayed in one hotel for more than a few days, always careful to keep the world at a distance. Imagine the discipline required for such a life. To never slip, to never use your real name, to meticulously cut the labels from every piece of clothing you own, so that not even a brand of soap could betray your origin. This is the hallmark of a deep-cover agent, someone trained to be an invisible shadow in the heart of the enemy's territory. Some believe she was a spy for the Soviet bloc, perhaps a member of an elite intelligence service sent to monitor the technological advancements of the North. Others suggest she may have worked for a smaller, more unconventional organization. Regardless of her masters, her life was a performance of the highest stakes, played out in the quiet lobbies of Norwegian hotels and the windy shores of the North Sea. Yet even the best performers can be caught in the rain. As she moved through Bergen in those final days of November, something changed. The meticulous planning seemed to falter, or perhaps the mission itself reached a terminal point. On the 5th of February, 1971, the city of Bergen was wrapped in the biting chill of a deep Norwegian winter. The sky was a heavy, monochromatic gray, pressing down on the colorful wooden houses that lined the wharf. In the quiet grounds of Mollendal Cemetery, a small group gathered not to mourn a friend or a sister, but to perform a final duty for a stranger. There were 16 police officers present, their heavy coats damp from the mist, standing in a line as a silent guard of honor. They were the only witnesses to the final chapter of a woman who had spent her life weaving a tapestry of shadows. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint, sweet perfume of tulips and lilacs that had been placed upon the lid of the coffin. It was a Catholic service, a gesture made by authorities who guessed at her faith based on the saints' names she had scrawled on hotel registration forms, though they could never be truly certain of the prayers she might have preferred. The coffin itself was a strange and deliberate choice. It was not crafted from polished oak or mahogany, but from cold, industrial zinc. The investigators, led by the tireless Harold Osland, were not ready to let her go forever. They knew that the science of 1970 was limited, and they harbored a quiet hope that the future might possess the keys to unlock her identity. By choosing zinc, they ensured that her remains would be preserved against the passage of time, making it possible for her to be disinterred if a family member ever came forward. As the metal box was lowered into the frozen ground, the hollow sound of earth hitting the lid echoed through the cemetery. No headstone was erected that day. No name was carved into granite. She was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, known to the records only by the date and the location where she had been found among the charred rocks of the Ice Valley. For 46 years, she remained a ghost in the archives, a puzzle that refused to be solved. But in the year 2016, the world turned its eyes back to Bergen. Deep in the basement of a local hospital, tucked away in a dusty cardboard box, a piece of her remained. It was her jawbone, preserved almost by accident, holding within it the secrets of her childhood. Modern science looked at the enamel of her teeth, analyzing the stable isotopes that had been absorbed from the water she drank and the food she ate as a young girl. The results were a revelation. They whispered of a life that began far from the fjords of Norway. The analysis suggested she was born around 1930, likely in or near the city of Nuremberg, Germany. As a young child, she had moved west, perhaps across the border into France or Belgium, just as the fires of the Second World War began to flicker across the continent. Her handwriting, with its elegant, continental flourishes, finally had a context. The details are hauntingly specific, yet frustratingly incomplete. We know now that she likely spent her formative years in a region where French and German cultures bleed into one another. We can imagine her as a young woman navigating the complexities of post-war Europe, perhaps recruited into the clandestine world of intelligence during the height of the Cold War. The 8 false passports, the wigs, the coded journals, and the meticulous removal of labels from her clothing were not the acts of a simple traveler. They were the tools of someone who existed in the gaps between nations. Yet, despite the DNA profiles and the isotope maps, no face from a family album has ever been matched to her. No relative has come forward to claim the woman from the Ice Valley. She remains a symbol of a forgotten era, a figure of profound loneliness who carried her true name into the silence of the earth. 50 years have passed since that dark November morning in 1970, and the Isdal Woman has become a legend of the North. In Bergen, the wind still howls through the narrow pass of the Ice Valley, and the scree slopes remain as indifferent as they were when she last looked upon them. Her mystery has inspired countless theories, podcasts, and late-night whispers, yet she belongs to no one but the history of the shadows. There is a certain peace in the mystery now, a quiet acceptance that some secrets are meant to be kept. She rests in Mollendal, no longer an active case file, but a guest of the city that tried so hard to understand her. The tulips have long since faded, and the zinc coffin remains undisturbed beneath the grass, holding its silent occupant in a grip of metal and memory. As we leave the cold slopes of Bergen behind, we carry with us the image of a woman who chose to be many people so that she could be no one at all. Her journey ended in the ice, but her story lives on in the quiet corners of our curiosity. We may never know if she was a spy, a fugitive, or a soul simply looking for a place to vanish, but we can offer her the dignity of our remembrance. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.